At 2:34 this afternoon, the Supreme Council issued a binding procedural order that has never been issued in the history of the Republic. Chief Magistrate Helena Voss read it aloud in a packed chamber. The operational instruction was one sentence. The executive authority shall comply with all lawful summons issued by provincial courts and shall not invoke immunity from judicial process during active governance. The room went silent, just the sound of procedural language entering the record. The executive authority had refused for 11 days to appear before the Provincial Court of the Northern Sector in a case alleging misuse of emergency decree powers. The Executive's counsel had claimed absolute immunity while in office. The Provincial Court rejected it, the Executive appealed, and at 2:34 p.m., the Supreme Council ruled against the Executive. Immunity does not exist during active service. The summons is enforceable. 2:47 p.m., the Executive issued a statement. The Supreme Council has exceeded its authority. Provincial courts do not have jurisdiction over executive emergency actions. I will not comply with a summons that compromises this office's ability to govern. That statement rejected the ruling's legitimacy. The question became operational. If the Executive refuses, who enforces compliance? At 3:12 p.m., the Federal Enforcement Bureau issued an internal memo obtained by governors within the hour. All personnel are reminded that the Supreme Council is the final authority. Any order issued carries the force of law. Agents will not follow executive instructions that conflict with Supreme Council rulings. The Bureau recognized the Supreme Council's authority. If the provincial court requests assistance in compelling the executive, the Bureau has signaled it will act. At 3:34 p.m., Governor Elias Tarn held a press conference. The Supreme Council has ruled. The executive must comply. If the executive refuses, the provincial court will issue a warrant for appearance. Provincial enforcement officers are authorized to execute it. If the executive does not appear voluntarily, we will compel appearance. That was a procedural announcement. Provincial law enforcement would enforce a court order against the executive. The question of how remained unanswered at 4:03 p.m. The executive's chief of security issued a directive. All EPS personnel are reminded that the primary duty is protection of the executive. Any attempt by external agents to serve process will be treated as a security matter. No external law enforcement will be granted unsupervised access. That directive did not say provincial officers would be blocked. It said access would be controlled. If provincial enforcement attempts to serve a warrant, the Executive Protection Service will intervene. At 4:29 p.m., General Mara Kalanoff issued a statement. The Supreme Council is the constitutional authority. All defense personnel are bound by oath to the Constitution. Military forces will not be deployed in support of any party refusing lawful compliance with Supreme Council rulings. The military would not protect the executive from enforcement. The defense forces were neutral. The executive could not rely on military support. But here is where it shifts. AC 5:07 p.m., 3 provincial governors issued a joint declaration. The Northern Sector, Western Coastal Province, and Central Highlands released identical statements. We affirm the Supreme Council's ruling. We call on the executive to comply. If compliance is not forthcoming, we are prepared to support enforcement through all constitutional means available. That phrase was vague. Provincial Governor's Command, provincial law enforcement, and, in certain cases, provincial militia units. The declaration did not specify means. It established that 3 governors were willing to act. AT 5:34 p.m. Federal Enforcement Bureau Director Anton Reeve held a closed meeting. Sources report, he stated, the Supreme Council has ruled, the executive has refused, and provincial authorities are signaling enforcement. We follow the law. The Supreme Council ruling is law. If a provincial court issues a warrant and requests assistance, we will evaluate it. The Bureau was trying to avoid choosing sides, but if they wait for a provincial warrant, then provincial enforcement has the lead. And if provincial enforcement moves first, the Executive Protection Service will respond. At 6:12 p.m., the executive held an address. I have been informed that certain governors are preparing enforcement through confrontation. I am the elected executive. I am not subject to arrest by provincial officers acting under political opponents' direction. The Supreme Council's ruling is constitutionally flawed. Any attempt to compel my appearance will be met with resistance. That word, resistance, suggested the Executive Protection Service would physically block provincial enforcement. At 6:47 p.m., the Northern Sector Provincial Court issued the warrant. The executive authority is hereby summoned to appear at 10 a.m. Provincial enforcement officers are authorized to serve this summons and ensure appearance. At 7:14 p.m., provincial officers arrived at the Central Governance Complex perimeter. 4 officers requested access to deliver a court summons. The Executive Protection Service denied entry. The officers stated they were serving a lawful court order. The EPS responded that legal documents must be submitted through official channels. The officers did not leave. They remained at the gate. Now watch what happens next. At 9:23 p.m., the Federal Enforcement Bureau issued a second memo. All personnel are advised that a provincial court has issued a summons. Provincial enforcement is at the complex attempting service. The Bureau recognizes that court orders issued under Supreme Council authority are lawful. Agents will not interfere with provincial enforcement executing valid court orders. The Bureau would not block provincial officers. At 9:47 p.m., Governor Tarn appeared on news channels. Provincial officers are at the complex to serve a summons. They have been denied entry. This is obstruction. I am authorizing provincial enforcement to take necessary measures. If obstruction continues, provincial emergency authority will be invoked. Emergency authority would give provincial officers legal justification to override federal jurisdictional boundaries and enter. At 10:12 p.m., EPS chief sent a message to all personnel. The situation is a provincial enforcement matter. We are monitoring. All personnel maintain standard protective posture. No external agents will be granted access without authorization. If provincial officers attempt forced entry, respond according to security protocols. That left enforcement response to individual officer judgment. That ambiguity was dangerous. At 10:34 p.m., General Kalinov issued a clarification. Defense forces will not deploy in support of provincial enforcement. Defense forces will not deploy in support of EPS resistance. Military units remain in standard readiness. Commanders will not act unless lawful orders are received through proper chain. The military was out. Provincial enforcement and EPS would resolve the standoff alone. At 11:07 p.m., the provincial court issued a second order directed at EPS. The Executive Protection Service is hereby ordered to allow provincial officers to serve a lawful summons. Obstruction constitutes contempt. Compliance required within 1 hour. If they continued blocking, they were in contempt. If they allowed service, they were permitting provincial enforcement against the executive's stated refusal. At 11:34 p.m., EPS Chief Marcus Vallon made a decision. He messaged provincial enforcement. Provincial officers may approach the outer entrance to deliver documents. 1 officer only. No detainment. Service of process only. A compromise. 1 officer could deliver the summons, but no arrest. At 11:41 p.m., a single provincial officer walked to the complex entrance carrying a sealed envelope. 2 EPS agents met her. She stated she was serving a court summons. The agents did not accept it. She placed the envelope on the ground. She stated service had been completed. She returned to the gate at 11:53 p.m. EPS agents retrieved the envelope and logged it as unaccepted delivery. Whether that constituted valid service was now a question for legal interpretation. There is a detail most people missed. At 12:17 a.m., the Supreme Council issued a procedural clarification released electronically. Service of a court summons upon the executive is valid when delivered to the Central Governance Complex and logged by security personnel. Personal receipt is not required. The executive is deemed to have received notice as of delivery time. The summons was legally served. The executive was required to appear at 10 a.m. Failure meant contempt. Contempt could be enforced through detention. At 1:03 a.m., the Executive's Council filed an emergency appeal challenging the clarification. The appeal argued the clarification was issued after service and could not retroactively validate defective service. At 1:47 a.m., the Supreme Council denied the stay. 1 sentence. The request for stay is denied. The summons remains in effect. At 2:14 a.m., the executive released a statement. The Supreme Council's actions confirm this process is political. I will not appear at 10 a.m. If provincial enforcement attempts to compel my appearance, they will be met with appropriate resistance. At 3:02 a.m., Governor Tarn issued a final warning. The executive has stated refusal. At 10 a.m., the court will convene. If the executive does not appear, the court will issue a detention order. Provincial enforcement will execute it. At 6:34 a.m., news channels reported provincial enforcement units mobilizing. Over 200 officers positioned near the complex, the largest law enforcement deployment against a sitting executive in the Republic's history. At 8:12 a.m., Bureau Director Reeve held a press conference. The Bureau respects provincial law enforcement independence and Supreme Council authority. If provincial enforcement requests assistance executing a lawful court order, we will evaluate that request. We will not obstruct lawful enforcement actions. At 9:34 a.m., EPS issued a final directive. All personnel maintain protective posture around the executive. No external enforcement permitted without authorization. Personnel authorized to use necessary measures to ensure security. At 9:47 a.m., provincial officers moved toward the complex. Over 100 officers in tactical gear. They carried no visible weapons. They stopped at the perimeter and requested entry. At 9:53 a.m., EPS denied entry. Provincial officers stated they were executing a court order. EPS stated entry prohibited without executive authorization. At 9:58 a.m., the provincial court convened. The executive was absent. The judge issued the detention order. The executive, having failed to appear, is found in contempt. A detention order is issued. Provincial enforcement is authorized to take the executive into custody. At 10:04 a.m., provincial officers received the order. The lead officer read it aloud to EPS agents. We are executing a lawful detention order. We are authorized to enter and take the executive into custody. Stand aside. This is the moment it stopped being routine. At 10:07 a.m., EPS agents did not stand aside. They formed a line. Provincial officers did not advance. For 3 minutes, both groups stood facing each other. At 10:11 a.m., Federal Bureau agents arrived. 12 agents positioned between the two groups. The lead agent addressed both sides. We are here to ensure lawful conduct without escalation. Provincial enforcement has a valid order. EPEs has a duty to protect. We request both parties de-escalate. At 10:23 a.m., Governor Tarn issued an order. Do not engage in physical confrontation. Maintain position. The order remains valid. We will pursue compliance, but we will not create a violent incident. At 10:34 a.m., the executive appeared on a balcony of the complex. Visible to enforcement officers, the executive did not speak. The message was clear: I am here, I am not fleeing, but I am not complying. At 11:07 a.m., the Supreme Council issued an emergency directive. All parties are ordered to maintain current positions. No enforcement action will proceed until this council convenes to address the impasse. Violation will result in sanctions. At 11:34 a.m., provincial officers withdrew from the immediate perimeter but remained nearby. EPS returned to standard posture. The confrontation paused at 12:02 p.m. International observers issued statements. The Alliance of Democratic States released a message. We are monitoring the situation with concern. We call on all parties to resolve this peacefully and in accordance with constitutional processes. That statement recognized neither the executive's authority nor provincial enforcement's authority. It acknowledged uncertainty. At 1:15 p.m., the Supreme Council convened in closed session. 7 magistrates deliberating on whether the detention order can be enforced against an executive who controls protective services and has stated resistance. At 3:47 p.m., the session ended. No ruling issued. A spokesperson stated deliberations would continue and a decision would be released when reached at 4:23 p.m. The executive remained in the complex. Provincial enforcement remained nearby. EPS remained at the perimeter. The Federal Enforcement Bureau maintained presence. No one knew how this would resolve. Here are the 3 scenarios. Scenario 1, the executive complies under pressure. Facing isolation from federal enforcement, military neutrality, and Supreme Council authority, the executive agrees to appear. The appearance is voluntary. The detention order is suspended. The crisis de-escalates. Scenario 2, provincial enforcement executes detention with federal support. The Supreme Council rules detention is enforceable. The Bureau assists provincial officers. EPS stands down after Supreme Council orders. The executive is taken into custody. The question of whether courts can compel executive compliance is answered. Scenario 3, the standoff continues and the system fractures. The Supreme Council cannot issue a ruling both sides accept. Provincial enforcement cannot execute detention without confrontation. EPs will not stand down. The executive governs from the complex. The provincial court operates without the executive. Federal agencies split. The Republic has two competing centers of authority. The record shows that at 6:34 p.m. on the evening of the detention order, the executive remained in the central governance complex. Provincial enforcement remained positioned nearby, and the Supreme Council had not issued a final ruling on whether detention could proceed. The procedural log contains no entry resolving the standoff. The question of who enforces judicial authority over executive defiance remains in the archive as an open file. What happens when constitutional compliance cannot be compelled is not answered by the system that requires compliance. It is answered by whether those with enforcement capacity choose to act.